eyes were missing, her tongue was missing, parts of her lip was missing, and a portion of her skull had fractured and a piece of her skull had been removed. Hey, what's going on, guys? Mr. Ballen here from TikTok. I'm your resident scary storyteller. Today I have a really cool story. It's actually one of the first kind of unsolved mysteries that really captured my attention and drew me into researching all of these kind of crazy unsolved mysteries that are out there. The too long didn't read version of this is you have 9 highly experienced hikers that go off into the mountains and die under extremely mysterious conditions. There are photos and journal entries. I mean, there's just a preponderance of evidence, but no one can make any sense of it. And to this day, it is one of the single most interesting things that I've ever found on the internet. So, in 1959, 10 hikers decided to head out on this 190-mile journey through the Ural Mountains in the northern part of the Soviet Union. Now, this was not a vacation. This was more like a mission to this group of experienced hikers, because in completing this 190-mile journey, they would receive their level 3 hiker certification, which at the time was the highest in the country. So they would be the top dogs in hiking. So on January 25th, they set off on this 16-day, 190-mile journey. The group was in good spirits. The pictures of them, they were happy, they were on course, everything was going right. And then they reached this kind of critical juncture in the trip. They reached this mountain pass that actually was subsequently renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of the group. The leader was named Igor Dyatlov. And so they reach this mountain pass and they know they need to go through it. They need to negotiate this mountain pass. And so they set up camp, and the plan is early the next day they're going to attempt to push through this mountain pass, and hopefully over the space of one day they would be able to get through that mountain pass and set up camp on the other side. So early the next morning they get up and they begin their ascent through this mountain pass. But unfortunately a very bad weather system rolled in and it pushed them off course. And in fact, it pushed them onto a different slope that the local Mansi tribe called Dead Mountain. And so they get pushed off course, they're not going to get through the mountain pass. And then one of the first strange things happens. For some reason, now this group of experienced hikers that should have known that their best bet at this point, because of the bad weather and being pushed off course, would be to retreat off the mountain and find somewhere that was more protected to spend the night, because at this point they got to set up camp somewhere. But for some reason they decide to stay on the exposed slope of Dead Mountain, which means that they would be setting up camp in not only just a wickedly windy area, and there's like risk of avalanche and any number of things could happen, but they'd also be exposed to negative 40-degree temperatures. They're like out in the open, just getting crushed by the elements. But for whatever reason, they make camp right on the slopes of Dead Mountain. So when the hikers don't show up to a rendezvous point that they were supposed to meet at a predetermined time, the folks they were set to meet, who obviously didn't meet up with the hikers, they let authorities know. It was noted that they had not made rendezvous, but because this was an experienced group, this was not a now let's send out the search party. It was more like, okay, they should have been here, but it's 9 people, they know what they're doing, they'll get here soon. 3 weeks go by, and still no one's heard from these 9 hikers. And at this point, a search party is sent out, even including military units are sent out to find them. And relatively quickly, the search party comes across the campsite on Dead Mountain, and what they find is just horrifying. So the first thing they notice is that the tent they had been staying in had been slashed open, except from the inside, meaning someone inside the tent had slashed it open. And then in the tent itself, neatly stacked, was all their cold weather gear, or the majority of their cold weather gear, like their shoes and their jackets. I mean, it's all there. And there's no sign of the hikers. And then near the camp, like literally right out of this tent, is this neat set of footprints leading down towards this forest. And investigators, when they looked at the footprints, they could determine a couple of things. One the majority of the hikers had either been barefoot or only wearing one shoe. In addition, their cadence, they were looking at the space of their footsteps, their gait, I should say, was indicative of a group of people that was walking calmly. This was not a panicked run away from your campsite. This was a walking calmly away from your campsite with not the right clothing on, probably no shoes on, down to the forest in an exposed mountain slope with negative 40-degree temperatures. So investigators, they start following these footsteps down towards this forest, and it leads them to this area right at the outside of this forest, right underneath this big cedar tree, where there's evidence of a campfire. And around that campfire are two of the hikers' bodies. And they're just wearing underwear, they're barefoot, and their hands had been like scraped. The palms of their hands had been badly scraped. And the tree that was right next to them had evidence of someone had been trying to climb it. A lot of the branches had been ripped down, as if someone had desperately tried to climb up this tree, but was unsuccessful. As if they were trying to, seek shelter from something or someone on the ground. But obviously they did not make it in time. Within several hundred feet of that campfire, the investigators found 3 other hikers' bodies. They were similarly underdressed, and it appeared, the way their bodies had frozen, that they were actually trying to make their way back up to the campsite. Investigators noted that one of those 3 hikers had a head injury that was consistent with someone repeatedly smashing their head. Another of those 3 had a strange rectangular bruise on their side. And then, oddly enough, while they were underdressed, each of those 3 were wearing the other's bits of clothing. It was like they all collectively put on the wrong clothes and not enough clothes. Despite the strangeness of the 5 bodies that were found and what they were wearing, or I guess what they weren't wearing, it was determined that they all died of hypothermia and that there was no foul play. It wasn't until May, when the weather warmed up a little bit and some of the snow had melted, that investigators were able to locate the remaining 4 hikers' bodies. And it was really the condition that they were found in, the second group of hikers, that really took this mystery and elevated it and made it this kind of urban legend, because it makes no sense how they were found. So the remaining 4 were found in this creek bed that came to be known as the Dyatlov Den. They were buried under about 13 feet of snow. And so of the 4 bodies that were found in the Dyatlov Den, one of them had simply died of hypothermia and kind of was a lot like the first group, right? There's no severe injuries, really, just they died of hypothermia. But the other 3, that was not the case at all. The 7th hiker had a skull fracture that occurred right before he died. The 8th hiker had these extreme chest fractures that it was almost like he'd been hit by a car. The 9th hiker really was the most unfortunate. Not only did she also have her chest kind of caved in, but her eyes were missing, her tongue was missing, parts of her lip was missing, and a portion of her skull had fractured, and a piece of her skull had been removed. Even more bizarre is, in this second group, they had all taken pieces of clothing from the other, indicating that they had all died at different times. It was like one would die, and then the other hikers would take their clothes and put them on. And then someone else would die, and they would take their clothes and put them on. And I guess even stranger than that is the clothes themselves had traces of radiation on them. The Soviet government was quick to close the case. They cited either a natural disaster or perhaps the hikers' incompetence as the result or the reason behind this horrible tragedy. But nobody really believed, nobody as in the family, the friends, really the Soviet population, they didn't believe that could be the actual explanation. Early on, after this case has been closed, the Soviet people, they started to believe a couple theories. One of them was there was this local Mansi tribe that was in the area that perhaps ambushed the hikers and killed them. That would kind of explain the reason for the hikers suddenly abandoning their tent and not being dressed, and also the injuries of the second group. That could be explained by, an attack by this Mansi tribe. But there was a couple issues with that theory. One, the Mansi tribe is known as this incredibly peaceful tribe. That it's just very uncharacteristic for them. There was also no other footprints leading into the area. It was just the footprints of the hikers that were, in the area. Another popular theory is a swift and violent avalanche that, the group couldn't have seen coming. They hear it at the last minute. They jump out of their tent, cut it open, they go running. But the problem with that is the tree line down near the forest they walk to, there's no sign that the trees have been damaged in any way. That, there weren't any debris from an avalanche like there would be. And in that area, there were locals like the Mansi tribe, and they didn't report an avalanche. They didn't hear an avalanche. And in fact, historically, there had never been a reported avalanche in that area. And subsequently, for decades afterward, there still has never been an avalanche there. Another popular theory is that the reason they left their tent in the first place is because when you get hypothermia, it can cause you to actually believe, kind of paradoxically, that you're actually too hot, and you start stripping your clothes before you ultimately succumb to hypothermia. But again, that doesn't really cover down on the injuries of the second group. And then, of course, with any sort of unsolved mystery at this magnitude, there's theories that range from, government cover-up to like a Yeti attack or an alien abduction. This case was closed, and the Soviet government kind of just gave a fairly ambiguous answer as to why. Authorities actually officially said that the cause of death for these hikers was a compelling natural force that they were not able to overcome, which that in and of itself is just an eerie way of putting it, right? They were unable to overcome a natural force. And it's not saying this was a natural disaster necessarily. They're just saying it was a natural force, which is just a very interesting way to put it. But either way, the case was closed, and that was that. But in 2019, Russia actually officially reopened this case. And they decided they were going to get to the bottom of it, because this was a case that, it is quite high profile in the world of kind of unsolved mysteries. I think if you Google top 10 unsolved mysteries, the Dyatlov Pass is going to come up in that top 10. This is just one of the more well-known cases. And so Russia officially reopens it in 2019, but they were only willing to look at 3 theories, which was an ice slab or a snow slab breaking and coming down and hitting them, an avalanche, or a hurricane. But unfortunately, despite diving into this and doing their diligence, they really didn't come to any sort of conclusive conclusion. They kind of ended it, they closed it, I should say, much the same way they did back when it actually happened in the late 50s, which is, yep, some natural force did this. They did, that was it. It was really unsatisfying. The only real conclusion that they made in 2019 was that no criminal activity was indicated. So whatever happened, they're saying was natural. It was not, it was not criminal. So with that, the mystery today remains technically closed, but unofficially, I would say this mystery is not even close to solved. And I'd love to hear in the comments what you think happened at Dyatlov Pass. So that's going to do it, guys. I encourage you to go check this out, Dyatlov Pass. It's fascinating. And please, if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. And also, please turn on notifications so you don't miss any of these stories. I'm going to be putting these out weekly. It'll range from mysteries to scary stuff to disturbing, creepy stuff. Kind of just generally interesting, darker content is going to be the focus of this channel. Also, be sure to check me out on TikTok. My handle is Mr. Ballen, same as my YouTube channel. I'm also on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. That's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.
It turned out that he had physically torn his vocal cords from screaming incessantly. In the height of World War II, Russian scientists wanted to find a way to keep their soldiers awake longer. And so they devised this experiment, this human experiment, to test the effects of extreme sleep deprivation. And so what they did is they rounded up 5 prisoners of war and offered them their freedom if they went through this experiment, which I can tell you went sideways. And so the way it worked is they were going to be put inside of this sealed gas chamber that continuously was going to administer this stimulant gas. It was an experimental stimulant gas. This is not something they knew much about, but they were fairly confident that it wouldn't kill them and that it would keep them awake. And so they put them inside the chamber and they started administering the gas. This was not at a time where they had closed circuit cameras. Those weren't around at the time. All they had was, they put microphones in there, and they had these 5-inch thick little porthole windows. They had one porthole window where the researchers could look into the chamber itself. So the experiment begins, and really for the first 3-4 days, everything was pretty normal. At about the day 4 mark, the researchers started to notice a change in what they were discussing, the subjects. It went from kind of small talk over those first few days to fairly dark. They started talking almost exclusively about traumatic events that had happened to them in their life. And around the day 4 mark is when the subjects started complaining about being in this test at all. The first few days was filled with some optimism that this was their ticket out of the terrible situation they were in, and then it really turned into, this is a terrible situation. I think it was around the day 6 mark, the subjects stopped talking to each other completely. They became paranoid of the other subjects, and they went to their own sections of the chamber. And in the chamber they had places to sit, there was food, there was water, there was a bathroom. There was books in there to read. They kind of took up space inside of the chamber. They began to believe that they could kind of like sell out their comrades in exchange for getting out of this experiment. So they would, one by one come up to the porthole or go over to one of the microphones that was obviously placed inside the chamber and start whispering these kind of imagined defenses of the other subjects to try to get them in trouble in exchange for being released from this experiment, which, that didn't do anything. The researchers, they didn't care what they said. They just listened and watched. After 9 days, the experiment took a significant turn for the worst. It was the morning of I think it was the 10th day, where the screaming began. One of the test subjects began screaming. And at this point, everybody is totally segregated. They're not talking to each other. They're muttering and whispering. And one of them just starts screaming. And so for 3 hours, they watch him scream at the top of his lungs and run back and forth across this little chamber until he stopped screaming. He's still running. And they could kind of pick up on the microphone that he was still making sound, but it was like these little squeaks. It turned out that he had physically torn his vocal cords from screaming incessantly. The other subjects didn't react to the screaming at all. It was like it wasn't happening, but they're in this confined space, right? It's so loud in there. And all that happened is, as he's screaming, the other subjects began ripping out pages of the book, soaking them, and then pushing them up against the porthole glass, obscuring the view. So by the time the subject who had torn his vocal cords stopped, by the time he tore his vocal cords and it went quiet, the researchers couldn't actually see into the chamber anymore. And once the guy had torn his vocal cords, there was no more sound in the room. So their view was obscured, and now it's gone silent. After 3 days of talking about what they're going to do, of complete silence in the room. They can't see in, it's silent. They're monitoring the oxygen levels in the room, and based on oxygen consumption in the room, apparently they could tell that there were people in there, probably at least 4 or 5, that were breathing oxygen because it was being consumed. So they believed they were alive, but after 3 days of silence, which really didn't make any sense, they determined that, well, either our microphones are broken, and that's a problem, or there's something wrong with the subjects themselves. So they decide that they're going to use the intercom to reach out to the subjects and basically tell them that they're going to come into the room. Hey, we're going to test the microphones. We're going to be coming into the chamber. You need to lay on the ground and not interact with us. If you comply, we will offer one of you immediate release and freedom. So there's silence after they use the intercom. They decide to do that. They talk to the intercom, and one of the subjects, now to this point again, for 3 days it's been silent. And one of the subjects, clear as can be, talks into the microphone and just says, "We no longer want to be freed." And so the researchers were like, okay, I guess they're alive and our microphones work, so they don't go in. They stay out of the chamber. Silence continues all the way up until the 15th day because the window's still obscured. The subjects are not speaking, they're not muttering, they're not whispering, it's just silence. And on the 15th day, at midnight on the 15th day, they decide that the experiment was over. And so what they did is they flushed the room of the stimulant that had been continuously pouring into the room. They turned that off, and they replaced it with fresh air. And that's when they started hearing the screaming from the subjects inside of the chamber. They were begging them, the researchers, to turn the gas back on, pleading with them, like begging, please turn it back on, as if they were dying. And then they opened the chamber, and now they're laying eyes on the chamber for the first time since like the 10th day. So it's been like 5 days. And they're seeing the chamber with their own eyes for the first time, and it's straight out of a horror scene. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive. The 5th subject, who had perished at some point, there was chunks of flesh that had been taken off of his chest and his leg and had been jammed into the drain in the center of the room. And they had turned on the water in the bathroom and had flooded the room. There was almost 4 inches of water on the ground, like murky, stagnant, lots of gross stuff in their water all over the ground. And there's this dead subject. And all 4 of them have also, there's chunks of their own flesh that's been ripped off of their body. And it was later determined that it was self-inflicted, these chunks of meat that had been pulled off of them. And it was not by teeth either, it was by hand. And also, they were eating it. So they were ripping off pieces of their body and eating it. The food storage that was down there hadn't been touched in days. It was like they had all completely lost their mind and began eating themselves. These subjects did not want to leave the chamber. They just continued to beg for the gas to be turned back on. And so finally they brought in some soldiers to actually extract the living subjects out of the chamber, but they fought so aggressively to stay there. And in fact, one of the subjects jumped up and bit the neck of one of the soldiers, and he actually bled to death. Also, one of the subjects in the struggle, his spleen ruptured and he bled to death. So now you have 2 casualties just getting them out of the room. They finally get the 3 remaining subjects, living subjects, out of the room, and they heavily restrain them. They bring them to a medical facility because they need to go under surgery because they've had chunks of their own flesh ripped off. They're totally emaciated. And the most injured of the 3 is immediately brought into surgery, while the other 2 were just kind of held in a holding room. And they try to give him a sedative in order to prepare him for surgery. This is not the anesthetic. This is just the sedative. And it's like he's immune to it. They give him a sedative, it does nothing. And he's just like resisting them, and he keeps begging to go back under the gas. And then finally they say, okay, well, we're just going to give him the anesthetic now. And when they bring it out, they tell him, we're going to give you an anesthetic and we're going to give you the surgery. He starts viciously fighting back. He does not want the anesthetic. He's pleading for them not to give him the anesthetic, that he must remain awake. He needs to remain awake, coming back under the gas. And in his struggle to not have the anesthetic given to him, he manages to tear one of the leather straps that was holding him down, so like an extreme amount of force. And then finally, when they give him the anesthetic, they had to give him like 10 times the dosage or whatever just to get him to calm down. As soon as he fell asleep, he died. So after he passes away, they move on to the next worse off subject, the guy who had torn his vocal cords and couldn't speak. They bring him in for surgery, and he can't speak, but he's shaking his head because he doesn't want the anesthetic, he doesn't want to go under surgery, and he's fighting with them, and he actually just passes out from exhaustion. And he too, once he falls asleep, or I guess falls unconscious, he dies as well. So now there's only 1 subject left. The other 2 that had lived to be pulled out of the chamber have now died as soon as they fell asleep, and the scientists don't have any idea why. Instead of bringing the last survivor into surgery, because now they've witnessed 2 surgeries end in death, they decide, let's put this guy back in the chamber and turn the gas back on, because apparently that's the one thing that's keeping these guys alive. And so in preparation for being put back into the chamber, they hooked him up with an EEG that basically measures your brain waves, which I guess they hadn't done to this point in the experiment. And so they put him in there, and the scientists are watching the readout of the EEG, and they noticed that like his lines would just inexplicably flatline and then go back to up and down and then flatline again. And one of them had the wherewithal to look at the subject as it's flatlining, and they could see that every time he closed his eyes, it was like he was micro sleeping, like these little blinks. Basically, every time he fell asleep, for a fraction of a second, it was like he was suffering a brain death over and over and over again. And as they're monitoring this, and they know what just happened to the other two, they died when they fell asleep. They're trying to rush to get the gas turned back on to keep this guy alive, but they didn't do it in time, and he eventually succumbs and falls asleep. And they can see before he ultimately dies that initially, when he finally fell asleep, the EEG showed that he had fallen into a deep sleep, and then he flatlined and his heart stopped and he died. All of the subjects died, and no one really knows what killed them. Was it the sleep deprivation? Was it the gas? It could be a mixture of the two, but we'll never know. But either way, all of them died. Now, this is actually just a story, and there's no evidence to suggest that it's even true. But during that time frame in the 40s, during World War II, there were known cases of horrific, unethical human experimentation happening, like in the Japanese, that awful Unit 731. I would not suggest Googling that unless you got a really strong stomach. You had in the concentration camps, the German concentration camps, human experimentation was definitely happening. And obviously Germany and Japan are not Russia, but it was just in this era where human experimentation was definitely happening. So even if this particular story, the Russian sleep experiment, is not true, I wouldn't be shocked in the least if there wasn't a similar study done somewhere. Obviously, the results could vary dramatically, but I do think that it's certainly possible that something like this could have happened. We continue to study sleep and sleep deprivation, and really there's not much known about it. We don't even really know why we sleep. But we do know that you will die if you go without sleep. I think the longest any human went without sleep was like 18 days. And I can actually speak from my own experience. I was a Navy SEAL for 7 years, and we go through something called Hell Week in initial training, where over a period of 5.5 days, you sleep for a total of 4 hours. Not every night 4 hours, but a grand total of 4 hours. And it's split up into two little chunks, 2 hours and 2 hours, and then there's like a 15-minute and 15-minute nap thrown in there too. And you really just lose your mind after 72 hours. I remember I was constantly hallucinating that when I was around my classmates, their head would turn into a big Rubik's Cube and start flipping around, and even when I got right next to them, their head would still be flopping around like a Rubik's Cube. And that's only 72 hours in. I can only imagine what would happen at 15 days. So that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed my version of the Russian sleep experiment. Go check it out on Creepypasta or just Google Russian sleep experiment. There's loads of stuff on the internet about it. If you're not already, do check me out on TikTok. So my handle on TikTok is the same as my YouTube handle. It's Mr. Ballen. I post videos in there daily. Lots of horror stuff, scary stuff. If you're into that, go check it out. Also, I have an Instagram, John B. Allen 416 is my handle there. More Navy SEAL content on there, but if you're interested in that, go check it out. And that's going to do it. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Let me know if you want to hear other stories that you think I do a good job telling. Let me know, and I'll see if I can do it. And that's going to do it. Thanks, guys.
There's a good reason why so many movies that are designed to be scary are set in the woods. Really, the woods at night. And if you go even further, most of them are like a cabin in the woods at night, right? It's because being in the woods at night, as human beings, checks a lot of fear boxes. You have the isolation factor. You're far away from society. That scares us. We don't want to be isolated. You feel more vulnerable that way. It checks the darkness fear factor. As humans, we're mostly afraid of the dark. You don't know what's around you or what's looking at you. You don't have the advantage of city lights beaming in. You're kind of probably removed from lots of light pollution, so you're kind of like in total darkness. And I think the third fear check in the box would be the fact that it's easy to hide in the forest. You don't know what's watching you because there's trees everywhere. You have animals, predators potentially, or even predatory humans that could be hiding at every turn. Hollywood has picked up on that and made bunches of movies of, the whole cabin in the woods trope where somebody's isolated and scared in the woods because it works. It's something that we are afraid of. And so today's story starts off a lot like all the other kind of cliche cabin in the woods scary stories, but this one, it's different. This one scared the heck out of me because as I read the account of what happened in this cabin in the woods, I imagined myself being in this guy's position and thinking about the psychological trauma that this would have on you. And I've actually had a literal cabin in the woods scary experience, and you can check it out. It's one of my top videos on my YouTube channel. It's What I Saw in My Room Still Haunts Me. You can check it out. It's my own cabin in the woods story. But having been through something like that, I was able to put myself in this guy's position, and this story terrifies me. So as you're listening to today's story, try to put yourself in this guy's position and think to yourself, what would you have done? But before we get into today's story, if this type of content appeals to you, the kind of strange, dark, and mysterious that I'm going to deliver to you in a story format, if that's kind of your thing, I would ask you to please gently obliterate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of these strange, dark, and mysterious uploads that I do every week. All right, let's get into today's story. In 2010, a 17-year-old boy is devastated to find out that his father had suddenly passed away. And it really sent shockwaves through the whole family. Not only because now they're grieving the loss of their father, their husband, but because so much of their daily lives they spent together. I mean, this was a very close family, and one of the things that they liked to do as a family was they owned a cabin. It was around Mount Bachelor in Oregon. It's a beautiful mountain where you can go snowboarding and skiing. They had this family cabin up there where in the wintertime, this family would spend a lot of time there. They would go up there as a family, spend time there as a family. It was this wonderful retreat. And as they're trying to settle the estate of their husband, their father, they're trying to figure out what they want to do with this cabin, because all of a sudden this place that, used to bring them so much joy and was a place of very fond memories suddenly felt kind of hollow. It just would never be the same. And so they decided that they were actually going to sell this cabin. And the 17-year-old boy was just really upset about this. He was very close to his father. He had some very fond memories of going hunting, and skiing, and snowboarding with his dad at this cabin. And so once the cabin was actually put up for sale by this boy's mother, he asked if, before they actually sell it, could he spend some time up there, I guess paying his respects in a way to his father. But he just wanted one more opportunity to spend some time in that cabin. And his mom said, go for it, take as many days as you want, go up and hang out in the cabin. But when you come back, we are going to sell the place. So his father had actually willed to his son his vehicle. And so the 17-year-old boy loads up his father's car. He goes out and he buys some snacks and drinks, heads up to the cabin in Oregon with the family dog whose name was Midnight. And his plan was just to go up to this cabin and basically try to enjoy being in this space one last time. Don't think about it as this place that now has no meaning because his father had died, but rather a place that he wanted one last positive memory before it was forever gone from their family. And so he gets up there, makes his way to the cabin, and he settles in for what turned out to be an abbreviated stay at the cabin. So in order to understand this story, we need to talk a little bit about the layout of the cabin itself. The cabin was 2 stories, and it was built into a mountain, Mount Bachelor in Oregon. And so the back half of the cabin was kind of settled into the mountain. So there were no windows, save a little sliver of window that fed into the bathroom, actually, in the back of the cabin. The front of the cabin was this beautiful, double-decker cabin with, windows on the second floor that fed into the master bedroom. On the second floor, there was a walk-out balcony that kind of jutted out a few feet from the second deck. The first floor, you could see in through all these beautiful windows. There was a sitting area, like a living room and a TV, and then a small kitchen as well. So the cabin was built in an area that was heavily forested. So they had to clear out a bunch of trees to even build this cabin when the family had this built years and years ago. And so they really only cleared away the front section of trees so that there was a clear shot to the house, but the sides and the back were very heavily forested with these huge tall pine trees. And they basically had this little tiny driveway that fed in through all the trees, and you had this one kind of clearing in front of the cabin. So if you were on the second floor of the cabin, where there's the master bedroom, there's a bed up there, and you were looking out that window, you'd be looking over the balcony out into a clearing, basically. But there's a tree line, 100 yards past that clearing that's very dense. And there's actually a couple of trees, fairly prominent trees, that are sitting in front of the cabin that they did not cut down. One of which, for the story, we'll call it the sitting tree. Parallel to the ground, about 20 feet up, was this beautiful branch that looked perfect for a whole bunch of people sitting on it. But it was 20 feet above the ground, and there wasn't really any way to climb up to it, and no one was trying to climb this tree. But there's this tree that basically has a seat, if you will. Like the branch is like a seat that is looking directly into the cabin. And that's going to matter later in the story. So clearing in front of the cabin with this one kind of sitting tree, and then a very dense forest 360 degrees beyond that one clearing. So when the 17-year-old gets to the cabin, he goes inside, he puts his drinks in the fridge, puts his snacks on the counter, he hooks up his PlayStation to the TV, and he's just like having a great time. His dog Midnight is roaming around, enjoying being at the cabin, and he's having a great time. And over the course of the first 2 days that he was there, it was everything he hoped it would be. It was like he was bonding with his father one last time. It was a peaceful time that he was there. He was happy to be there. And he was just enjoying himself, eating snacks and playing video games for a couple of days. He actually left a couple times to go snowboarding too. But on the third day that he was there, things started to get pretty weird. So on the third day when he got up, it had snowed dramatically the night before. A couple of feet of snow on the ground, still snowing pretty heavily. And he's like, I just don't feel like brushing off my car and trying to go to the store or go to the slopes to go snowboarding. I'm just going to basically be shut in for the day. And he was excited about it. He's like, great, me and my dog Midnight can bomb around the inside and play some more video games and eat some more snacks and do whatever. Midday that day, Midnight needed to pee, so he went outside with Midnight and let Midnight run around and go to the bathroom. And while he's out there with his dog, he notices there are some footprints in the snow that looked relatively fresh. And this is the first time that he's left his cabin that day, so they aren't his. And his neighbors were pretty far away, and he figured that they were older, that they were probably not going to be trekking around the woods. So he's thinking to himself, I wonder who made these footprints. And he's looking at them, and they started in the woods. So the woods are not that far away from where he is. He's in a relatively small clearing just in front of his cabin. But he can tell these fresh footprints have come out of the woods. And they're basically right in front of this clearing. And he notices that they bank around and go to the back of his cabin and kind of go up onto the mountain. And he kind of just starts walking and following the footprints a bit, and they kind of disappear up onto the mountain behind his cabin. And he's not overly concerned or anything, but he definitely takes note that more than likely somebody was walking around his cabin. Maybe it was someone who got lost, maybe it was a neighbor. I mean, he's rationalizing it. He's thinking, you know what, it can't have been anything too serious. Obviously, they didn't knock on my door. They didn't need anything. And so he kind of writes it off. So that night, he stays up late playing video games, and his dog is sleeping next to his chair. And at some point, he's tired and he wants to go to bed. So he draws all the curtains, so blackout curtains around the downstairs, shuts all the blinds, and locks all the windows, all the doors, and heads upstairs to the lofted second floor where the master bedroom is. He gets in bed, turns off all the lights, everything's locked, everything's shut, the dog climbs into bed, and the dog would sleep up near his head. And suddenly the dog jumps up, still on the bed, and looks at the stairs leading downstairs to the front door. And its ears are perked up, like it's heard something. And it wasn't unusual for the dog to be a little jumpy, maybe it heard something. He wasn't overtly concerned. But when Midnight, the dog, jumps off the bed and sprints downstairs after having this sudden alertness, and he's listening, now he is a little bit worried. He's thinking, well, I saw footsteps yesterday walking around my cabin, and now it's the middle of the night, and my dog is downstairs acting like it's heard something, and he hears the dog, Midnight, pacing around the downstairs, like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Every indication is the dog wants to go outside. That's the noises that he's picking up that signal from the dog. And so finally, even though he's feeling a little bit unnerved by this, he decides to go down and see what Midnight wants. And so Midnight is by the door, ears perked up, very eager to go outside. It's pacing, and he thinks, you know what, she just needs to go to the bathroom. And so he opens the door with Midnight, and he goes outside, and he expects his dog to pee. But Midnight doesn't need to pee. Midnight starts kind of stalking around the corner and looking out across the clearing towards the sitting tree in that direction, and it just stops. And it's looking at something very intently, as if it spotted an animal or something in the woods. And so the boy is looking at the dog, and he's kind of trying to encourage the dog to do its business so they can go back in the cabin. And he's starting to feel really uncomfortable. He's looking around. He's thinking like, okay, I don't know what's going on. Like, I'm a little bit concerned now. And he's sensing that Midnight is going at some point to try to take off after whatever she sees in the woods. And so preemptively, he grabs Midnight and says, all right, drags Midnight back in the house and shuts the door and locks it. And takes one last look out the window of the door and just kind of looks out. I mean, it's dark, he doesn't have a light or anything. And he's like, man, that's creepy. Locks it, shuts the blinds, confirms everything downstairs is locked, and it does a sanity check to make sure everything is locked, and he goes back upstairs with Midnight. Midnight did not want to go back upstairs. He had to practically drag her back upstairs. And then when they did get back in bed, Midnight refused to get in bed, but instead stood next to the bed looking at the stairs, wanting to go downstairs, periodically looking back at him, and then down at the stairs. Midnight wanted to go back outside. So he's laying there in bed, and he's taking full stock of the fact that his dog is very much on edge. But he's trying to fall back to sleep, trying to convince himself that nothing weird is going on. And after about 30 minutes of that and being unsuccessful at falling asleep, as he's laying there, it's silent, and all of a sudden he hears footsteps on his roof. Now, the roof is right above his head. I mean, he's on the second floor. There is no attic. The roof is right there. And he hears about 6 footsteps. And he actually described it as something with hooves. And his dog instantly looks up as well. And they're both watching the ceiling as what sounds like hooves walking along the roof of this cabin. And it was so distinctive that immediately what he's thinking to himself is, how could a deer or a moose or something get on the roof of the house? There is no way, unless you leapt from a tree or had a ladder, for you to get on the roof. And how did we not hear, if they leapt from a tree or a ladder even, how didn't we hear a loud slamming sound when they first landed on the roof? Like, it's as if they've been there for a while and we just didn't know. And so then the footsteps stop, and at this point the dog stops looking at the roof and goes right to the balcony, which is shut. There's a door shut to the balcony, and there's curtains drawn against the balcony, so he can't see what's out there. And so the 17-year-old boy is sitting in his bed, and he's like, oh, I don't want to see what's on the porch. And he even says in his write-up about this that he's like, I'm a pretty tough guy, but I'm in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night, totally isolated. Like, I almost don't want to know what's going on outside. I just want to pretend it's not happening. But at some point, he musters the courage to go out on the balcony. And so he walks over very timidly to the door, and Midnight's there ready to go outside. He takes a deep breath and he slides open the blackout curtains. But there's no light outside and there's no light inside, so it's just kind of darkness. And he can barely make out even just the snow that's on the balcony right in front of him. He takes a deep breath and he unlocks the door and he opens it up. And the first thing he does is he turns and he looks up at the roof to see if there's a deer or a moose or something on the roof. There's nothing up there, and he's kind of peering around, and he can't even see footprints up there. So in a way, he's kind of relieved, right? Like, I must have been imagining that. He had a flashlight, and so at this point, he's looking back at his roof of his cabin, and he shines the light real quick, and it's totally dark out, right? So this light goes very far, and he sees nothing. And the dog at this point, he can hear the dog making kind of some commotion below him. It's angling itself to look out in the direction of the sitting tree and out towards that tree line where the dog had originally been fixated on something in the tree line. And so just doing his diligence, the 17-year-old scans from the top of the roof where he sees nothing. He starts scanning over to the side of the house, right? Like, this is the direction of the sitting tree. He's looking over here, and he's looking, he's scanning the tree line, just looking for anything that might have been on the roof. And he's looking, and he's looking, and he's looking, and then he gets to the sitting tree. And his flashlight stops on a man crouched on that perch, 20 feet off the ground on the sitting tree, who looked very tall. He had his hands holding onto the branch right above him, and his mouth is open. And he's holding onto the branch, and he's looking directly at the boy. unblinking, 100% focused on him. He's less than 50 yards away from him at this point. And it took him a second, the 17-year-old, to register what his flashlight was pointed at. And he panics and he drops it. And the dog reacts to the drop flashlight too. And because he's alone out here, he needs to protect himself, so he scoops that light back up and he shines it one more time to see, like, holy cow, like, what did I just see? And the guy on the branch is now gone. And he scans the ground. There's nothing. And he's terrified at this point, so he grabs his dog, throws Midnight back into the cabin, runs back in, shuts the door, locks it, closes the blinds, turns off his light, and literally gets back in bed with his dog, and he's now basically cowering on the bed. So at this point, they're sitting on the bed. Midnight is no longer acting like she wants to go outside. I think she's picking out potentially on the paranoia. Okay. At this point, the boy and his dog are sitting on the bed, and they're both scared at this point. Midnight, was fearsome while she was outside, but now that she's back inside, she doesn't want to go near the door either. She's rubbing up against him. She doesn't want to go anywhere. And they're sitting there, and the boy, all he's thinking to himself is, did I really just see that? It looked like an unnaturally tall man. How did he get in the tree? That's 20 feet off the ground. There's no way to get up into the tree. And why was it sitting there with its mouth open, staring at me? And who was on the roof? Was anything on the roof? And if this thing can get 20 feet up into a tree, it certainly can get on the roof of my cabin, I would imagine. But what was it? So he's having this type of thought process, and he's realizing, too, that it's not that late in the night. He still has hours until the sun's going to come up. And as he's basically panicking and feeding off his own paranoia, and it's getting worse and worse by the second, he hears tapping on the door, on the front door of his cabin. And his heart sinks. And he and his dog kind of look in the direction of the tapping, and he knows he's not going to go open the door. He knows the door is locked. He knows everything is locked. He's panicking that maybe it wasn't, but he knows he locked it. And the tapping just sounds like a finger tapping on the window. And at some point, the tapping stops, and he thinks, okay, maybe they'll just go away. And then he hears what sounds like footsteps outside, and then tapping begins on the side of his cabin. Not the front door anymore, like the wall of the cabin. Now it's a little bit louder. The tapping continues up the side of the house, and then it stops. And he's sitting there, and he's thinking, whatever this is, he's walking around my cabin. And then he hears tapping on the little slit that is the window that feeds into the bathroom that's right behind the bedroom that he's in right now. So 6 feet away, maybe 10 feet away. Whatever this thing is, it's now literally just a small pane of glass away, tapping on the glass. And so now he's petrified. And he's just hoping that this thing goes away. It doesn't. He goes to the other side of the cabin and starts tapping on the wall on the other side of the cabin. And makes it all the way back to the front, where it begins tapping on the glass of the front window, back to the door. And he's just thinking, like, whatever this is walking around my cabin, tapping all over my cabin. And all the tapping stops. His heart's racing. It's the middle of the night. He's in the middle of the woods somewhere. He's totally isolated. And then it's like his worst nightmare comes true. He hears footsteps on his balcony, and then tapping right on the big sliding glass doors of the door leading up to the balcony. And he knows that right behind a blackout curtain and a pane of glass is this tall man, more than likely, who's right on his balcony. The tapping on the balcony goes on and on and on, and all of a sudden it stops. And he's just waiting for it to open the door and come inside. But it doesn't. Instead, it goes on the roof, and it starts tapping on the roof directly above him. And the tapping continues all night. And so finally, the sun comes up. He hasn't slept all night, and he finally gets the courage to go over to the balcony and open up the curtains and see what's out there. When he does, there is nothing out there, but there's footprints as if someone had been pacing on the balcony all night. He opens it up and finally jumps out and looks up on his roof. There's nothing on his roof. You can see all these footprints on his roof. He looks down, and it's like a racetrack of footprints all around his house. Someone had been basically stalking his house all night, and then the footsteps retreat all the way to the sitting tree and then go back into the woods. He packed up his stuff, he left, and he couldn't have been happier that the family sold that cabin, because he was never going to go back. So to this day, he has no idea what it was, and even if it was just a person who was tapping on your windows and your walls and your roof and your balcony, even if it was just a human being doing that, that would be horrifying. Let alone if it was something else, something paranormal. So if you want to check out my video about my experience, it's on my channel called What I Saw in My Room Still Haunts Me. It's eerily similar to the one that I just described of this 17-year-old in Oregon. And so I'd love to hear in the comments what you think was doing all that tapping. And if it's possible, that was just some person screwing with this poor kid, or maybe it was something else. So let me know in the comments, and I'll try to get back to as many people as I possibly can. If you haven't already, please, if you like this story, gently obliterate the like button and subscribe and turn on all post notifications so you can get 3 to 4 videos just like this every week. If you want to get in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also quite active on TikTok. My handle is Mr. Ballen over there, and I go live on there all the time, 10 o'clock Eastern most days of the week. So I hope to see you in one of those other places, and I hope you'll continue to watch my videos here on YouTube. And that's going to do it, guys. Thank you very much. Until next time. I read a lot of scary stories, but today's top story legitimately freaked me out. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come out to dinner with you to a very fancy restaurant, order a ton of food, wolf it down, and before the check arrives, say you need to go to the bathroom, but just leave the restaurant. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1982, a very outdoorsy teenage girl and boy who had recently started dating decided to go camping in Maine. Around 1 a.m. on the first night they were there, the girl wakes up because she has to go to the bathroom, and she's about to unzip her tent when she stops because she hears some strange noises coming from outside their tent. It wasn't that loud, but it sounded distinctly like something was digging in the ground. But she really had to go, and she figured, you know what, it's probably just some small animal or something. And so she begins to unzip the tent. And there's a little bit of moonlight that night, and there was a clearing outside of their tent. So the moonlight's pouring through, so she has plenty of illumination. And so she looks through this tiny hole, and she can't believe what she sees. It is a grown woman squatting down about 2 or 3 feet away from their tent. Her back is to them, so she can't see that she's looking through the tent. And she's feverishly digging into the ground in front of her. The girl literally falls backwards into her tent. She's so startled by what she sees. And she lands on her boyfriend, who immediately gets up, and he's like, "What's going on?" And she goes, shh, and she points at the little hole where she had unzipped the tent, and she goes, "Look." The boy is confused, but he can tell his girlfriend is very serious. So he sits up quietly and he looks through the little opening in the door, and he sees the digging woman. The boy recoils and looks at his girlfriend, and he's like, "What is going on out there?" He takes a flashlight, and she's telling him, "Don't do it." And he opens up the tent a little bit more, and he aims his flashlight directly on this woman. And this gets her attention, and she stops digging, and she stands up slowly, and she turns around and faces them, and she's got no expression. She's not giving them any indication why she's there. She's not acting aggressive. She's not acting scared. She's just completely neutral. And she stands there staring at them for quite a while before turning around and just walking away from their campsite. And after a little while, when they were pretty certain she was gone, they open their tent all the way, they go outside, they kind of scan around with their flashlights, and she's nowhere to be found, and they go to where she was digging, and it's just this weird 4-inch deep hole in the ground. There's no rhyme or reason to why she was doing that. And so after sitting there wondering what they should do, they settled on, well, tomorrow we'll tell the park rangers that she was here, and maybe they'll do something about it. And so feeling pretty confident that this woman's not going to come back, they both go back into the tent, they zip it shut, they get in their sleeping bags, and they're about to go to sleep when they hear someone running towards their campsite. And they know it's this woman. They immediately unzip the tent and they look out, and now the woman's not digging anymore. She's rummaging through some of their stuff that's outside of their tent. And the way she's doing it, they described as monkey-like. She'd pick something up, look at it, and throw it over her head. She'd pick the next thing up, throw it over her head. Back and forth, just throwing things behind her. And so the boy gets out and he shines a light on her and goes, "You need to leave." And she doesn't react. She just keeps flipping through all their stuff until he gets pretty forceful and says, "You need to leave right now." And at that point, she kind of stops and looks at him like, "Huh, what are you doing here?" And then she gets up, turns around, and walks away. Now the couple really doesn't know what to do because she's clearly willing to come back after being confronted. But they stayed outside their tent for about 15 more minutes, shining their light and making lots of noise and treating her like she's an animal, and they're just trying to scare her away from the campsite. And after a little bit of time, they thought, okay, there's no way she comes back now because, we were pretty aggressive with her this time and she seemed to really get it. They both do go back in the tent, and as soon as they zip it shut, they hear her come running straight back to the site, like she was literally waiting in the wings for when they went back in the tent. And this time she runs back to the hole in the ground, and she's just feverishly digging into the ground as fast as she can. And this time they come out of their tent and they're mad, and they are screaming at this woman to get the F out of here. What are you doing? And this seems to kind of frighten the woman, who gets up and she looks at them like, why are you yelling at me? And she runs away, and it looked almost animalistic the way she was running away, like she was feral. The boy and the girl are totally shaken up at this point. It's about 1:30 in the morning, and this woman just keeps coming back to their site, and they don't know what to do about it, so they turn on some lanterns, and they turn on their flashlights, and they decide, we're just gonna stay outside until the morning. That way we know she doesn't come back and doesn't steal anything from us. But by about 3:30 in the morning, they've been outside for 2 hours, they're getting cold, they're super tired, the woman's nowhere to be found. And so they finally say, do you want to go back in and get some sleep? I think this time she's really gone. They get back in their sleeping bags and they go to sleep. They don't hear her again. The next morning when they get up and they unzip their tent, they look outside and all of their stuff has been thrown all over the campsite. And the hole in the ground that the woman had dug that was previously about 4 or 6 inches deep is now well over a foot deep. And they realize this woman must have been lurking in the shadows in the woods, watching them from 1:30 to 3:30 in the morning. That whole time they were out there kind of warding her off. She was just waiting, just watching them the whole time in the shadows. And as soon as they went into their tent, she must have given it a little bit of time, but then she ran right back over and she ransacked their site. But the strangest thing was, after they looked through all of the stuff she had chucked around, nothing was missing, and there was some pretty expensive stuff that was laying out that she could have taken but didn't. After they picked up their site, they went to the park ranger and they told them about what had happened, but the ranger has no idea what to make of it. He's never heard of such a thing. And so the couple just leaves that day because they're not about to spend another night here. And to this day, they have no idea why this woman was running onto their site and digging into the ground and rummaging through their stuff. It was like she was just a wild animal. In 2015, an experienced outdoorsman named Bob, along with his wife, his young daughter, and their 2 German shepherds, decided to go camping in a remote part of northern Oregon. When they arrived at the site, Bob began setting up a big family tent for everyone to sleep in, and his daughter said, hey, do you mind if I sleep in the spare 2-man tent that we always bring with us? Bob and his wife deliberated for a minute, but said, you know what, that's fine, but you gotta bring Guts. That's one of the German shepherds. Guts needs to sleep with you because he's gonna be your protection. So that night, after some s'mores around a campfire, Bob's daughter, along with Guts, retreat to their 2-man tent, and Bob, his wife, and Leah, the other dog, retreat to their tent. That night, Bob wakes up suddenly to what sounds like footsteps outside of his tent. And he looks to his side, and his wife is still in the tent with him, and so is Leah, the other dog. And he listens really closely, and he can hear his daughter is snoring, and he can hear the sound of Guts breathing. So his whole family is accounted for, but he still hears these footsteps. And they don't sound like light little scampering sounds like you might expect from a squirrel or some small critter. They sound heavy, like a big creature is roaming around their campsite. But Bob's dogs are really keyed in to protecting their family, and since Guts and Leah are not up going crazy about whatever's out there, he figures, you know what, it's gotta be an elk or something, and it's not gonna do anything to us, so Bob ultimately just goes back to sleep. The next morning, Bob gets up, and everybody's just fine. There's no sign of any intruders in their campsite, and so that only confirms to him that, yep, it was just some harmless animal kind of walking around the wilderness, because we're in a pretty remote area. That morning, they decide to go for a walk down the road that was right next to their campsite. And so they take the dogs, they start walking, and they make it a couple hundred feet down this road when all of a sudden Guts sees something or hears something and takes off sprinting down the road and turns down this little access road that branches off of the road they're on into the woods. And Bob is thinking, oh no, there's a campsite down there, and this big German shepherd's gonna bound up on them, and something bad's gonna happen. And so Bob, his heart's racing, he starts taking off after Guts. He goes down the access road and he finds Guts stopped right outside of a campsite. But there doesn't appear to be anybody in the campsite. But there's a tent, there's a cooler, there's a table, there's all the things you would expect at a campsite, just no people. So Bob runs up and he grabs Guts and he yells out reflexively, "Hey, I'm really sorry, he's totally harmless, I don't know what he saw, hey, we're leaving." But then before he leaves, he realizes on the tent there's this big scratch through it, like it's been cut open. And curiosity gets the better of him, and so he kind of walks up, keeping an eye out in case he's wrong and there are people still here. But as he gets closer, he realizes there's definitely no one here. This site is abandoned. Because he's looking around and all of their stuff has just been ransacked. There's scratch marks on everything, like animals have clearly come through here. And Bob, who is an avid outdoorsman, he knows how much some of their equipment cost. And he's thinking, why would anyone abandon this really expensive tent or this really expensive cooler? And as he's thinking about that, he turns and he sees there's a propane tank, a solid metal propane tank that has been completely flattened. But there's no tree that's fallen nearby. There's no source. There's no way that could have been flattened. So he's definitely unsettled by this, but ultimately he decides, you know what, I'm gonna take my family, go back to my campsite, I'll just call the park rangers, they can come down here and they can figure out what this is. Later that afternoon, Bob and his family are back at their campsite just a couple hundred feet away from this abandoned campsite. And at one point, his wife gets up to go use the bathroom. She walks about 70 feet away behind a tree and she squats down, and then all of a sudden, she gets up and starts running back towards camp. And Bob sees this, he turns and sees her running towards him. At the same time, Guts gets up and starts sprinting towards her. And so Bob's thinking, what the heck is going on? Bob turns to his daughter and says, stay right here with Leah. And Bob gets up and starts running towards his wife. And Guts, at this point, has run to his wife and past his wife. Guts has run way into the woods. And as Bob is running up to his wife, he's like, what's going on? Why are you running? What's going on? And she says, I don't know. I just had this horrible feeling someone was watching me. And when I turned, I already saw Guts running towards me and it scared me. And so that's why I'm here. And he's like, look, go with our daughter and with Leah. I'm going to see what's going on. And so his wife leaves and Bob draws his pistol and he starts walking out towards where Guts has now stopped. Hair raised, growling, it's yapping and barking at something in front of it. And Bob's looking and he can't see anything. And finally, after not being able to figure out what the heck is going on, he just takes Guts and goes back to his campsite. When Bob got back to his campsite, he wanted to leave. And his wife wanted to leave. His daughter didn't really know what was going on, but the attitude was, we want to leave. However, it was getting late and they had a bunch of stuff they would need to pack up. And it was going to be a real ordeal trying to do that, especially without any light. So they decide, okay, we'll stay one more day and we're going to leave first thing in the morning. In Bob's head, he's thinking, okay, I heard weird footsteps outside. You know, we have this abandoned campsite nearby that's been thrashed up in the flattened propane tank. And now my wife is running away from something and Guts is seeing strange things in the woods. Like, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. And he decides he's going to set up a tripwire all the way around his campsite using a rope tied at about 8 inches off the ground, where along the rope would be little pieces of metal that would clang together, so if anything touched the rope, it would make the metallic clinking sound, then it would alert Bob that someone's here. And so Bob goes over to the edge of the site where there's an obvious starting point for this tripwire, and he bends down to tie the rope, and he realizes, oh my God, someone's already done this. There is another tripwire that's already been built around the outside of our campsite. It's just been cut, it's been broken. Like, it doesn't work, but it's here. Someone else who was at this campsite felt concerned enough about whatever was in the woods that they already had this idea. Bob didn't even tie his perimeter. He just drew his gun, told his family, get in the truck, and he stayed up all night protecting his family in the truck. As soon as the sun came up, they packed up and they got the heck out of there. Bob is convinced that there is something out there in the woods in northern Oregon that was walking around their campsite at night, that's scaring their dogs, that's stalking them, basically, and watching them from a distance. And probably whatever is out in the woods is the same thing that caused the previous group to set up their own tripwire. And it's also probably the reason the other campers at the other campsite were willing to abandon their nice equipment to get the heck out of there, because they are not messing with whatever the heck is out in those woods. In 2004, wildland firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks, this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked, and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns, and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, he knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear, and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows, like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing, and in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside, and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's going to emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's going to be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin, because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is going to have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving, and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her and she's still on the branch, now turned around, facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They got to fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest? And the guy kind of laughed, and he was like, you know, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from there. So besides that, I don't know. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come out to dinner with you at a very expensive restaurant, eat a ton of food, but before the bill gets there, say you're going to the bathroom and just leave the restaurant. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just John Ballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Before you skip today's video, just watch the top story. It's called Turn Around. Watch it start to finish so you can see the ending, and then once you've seen the ending, watch it again. It is so creepy when you know what was actually going on the whole time they were there. But before I get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to spot the like button on their next set of bench press, and then as soon as they start to fatigue, walk away. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In the early 2000s, a teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals, silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals, and all day long, they don't see a single animal, they don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, you know, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, you know, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite, and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, "Oh, it must have been the wind." And Eben says, "No, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind." So Eben's father is like, "Well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly?" And Eben's like, "No, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly." They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent, and they're really confused at what they see. The two rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up, because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here, because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened, because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, "Okay, let's just go to bed." They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly, and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple 100 meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, "Okay, I must have just been dreaming," and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, "What's going on?" And his dad goes, and he goes, "Can you hear that?" And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier. And Eben's father turns to Eben and says, "Before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys." After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening, because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest, and it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them, and then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle, and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again, and it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on the zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far, and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it, and the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period, and prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Katie and her father decided to go camping at one of their favorite campgrounds in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Katie loved going camping with her father because he was this totally accomplished outdoorsman, and he used to be a wilderness guide for much of his life, and so she just always felt like she was in great hands whenever she was out in the wild with him, and she had kind of become a fairly accomplished outdoorswoman herself. When they arrived at the campground, the parking lot was packed with cars, and they're like, shoot, I wish we'd called ahead a couple weeks ago and reserved a site because they're probably not even available now. But they went to the front desk and they were like, you're in luck, we have one available, but it's the one that's way over there. It was this one campsite that was kind of isolated from the rest of the campground. It was far away from the bathhouse, it was far away from where you go swimming, and it was far away from the parking lot. It was just like really inconvenient. And whenever they came camping here, it was like the one site they didn't want to use. But beggars can't be choosers. They were happy to even have a site, and so they drove all the way down this little road into this very isolated campsite, kind of in the middle of this forest. Once they got there, they began setting up their respective tents because they were not going to be staying in the same tent. They each had these very small backpacking tents, which were so small that you could either zip it up all the way and stay warmer and more protected, but you had to sleep in a ball because your legs would not fit otherwise. Or you could unzip the front of your tent, and when you lay down, you could extend your legs fully, but your legs are protruding outside of your tent. So you could only do that in warmer weather and if you were comfortable having your legs poking out into the wilderness. After they set up their tents and they get their coolers set up and they have all their stuff kind of the way they want it, they go out hiking for the rest of the day. When they come back, they're totally exhausted, they fall asleep, and nothing of note occurs over that first night. The next day they get up, they go back out, they go hiking all day all over again, and they come back that night and they are totally exhausted again. And they get into their tents and they go to bed. This night, something of note would happen. At about 3 a.m., Katie wakes up and she hears footsteps walking towards the campsite from a little ways off. They're in the woods somewhere. And she's thinking, okay, it's got to be my father because he's diabetic and every night he gets up to go to the bathroom maybe 3-4 times, and he probably was just walking to the bathhouse and now he's walking back. But she realizes the bathhouse is over here, not over here. So what is he doing walking towards the campsite from this side? The footsteps come out of the tree line, they come into the clearing that is their campsite, and they stop about 2-3 meters outside of Katie's tent. Now there were no windows on Katie's backpack tent, there was just a little fence at the front and the back that kind of pointed down, and so she couldn't see out anyways, and there was no illumination out, so you can't even pick up a silhouette. It's just total darkness out there, she can't see who's out there, she can only hear them. But she's thinking, okay, maybe my dad got lost coming back from the bathhouse because he didn't have a flashlight and he walked too far. That's possible. Or, he could have decided to relieve himself just in the tree line, even though he's not known to do that. He's a guy that goes to the bathhouse. And so she's running through these scenarios that are convincing her that, oh, that's just my dad. But what she really wants to hear is that person walk away from her tent and get into her father's tent, because that will confirm in her mind that that was her father. And so she's sitting here waiting for that confirmation, and she hears the footsteps again, but instead of walking around her tent to her father's tent, this person walks right up against her tent very quickly. And they clearly begin leaning over her little tiny tent because she can hear them breathing right above her. And this is when she realizes, that's not my dad. And as she's having this terrible revelation that some stranger is outside her tent right now, she has an even worse revelation. It was a warm night that night, so she was sleeping with her tent unzipped and her legs poking out again. She musters the courage to begin slowly retracting her legs back inside of her tent. But before she's able to do that, this person stands up, turns, and starts walking towards the base of her tent where her legs are. She's completely frozen and terrified about what's about to happen. But this person doesn't stop at her feet. They keep moving and in fact start circling her tent. But because they were making a lot of noise and walking around her, it allowed her to pull her legs back into her tent without, this person hearing her. And so she had the illusion of safety being inside of her tent, but her tent is still unzipped. So she's waiting for this person to come around and crouch down and look inside of her tent because it's open. And so she's just looking down there hoping that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, right at this moment, the person walked to the base of her tent and came to a stop, right outside where the opening to the tent is. And so she's sitting there thinking, please don't come in here, please don't come in here, please don't come in here. And even though her feet are pulled up into her tent, she suddenly feels something pinch her foot, and she knows it's a hand. Something has grabbed my foot. And she stifles a scream and she starts shaking uncontrollably because her instincts are telling her, don't let this person know you're awake. And luckily, as she's sitting there shaking from fear and trying to be quiet as best as she can, she's holding her mouth. This person stands back up again and goes back to the spot next to her tent and leans over the tent once again, and she can hear them breathing right over her. And so for several minutes, she lay there shaking with this random person who pinched her foot a minute ago, hovering over her tent in the middle of the night. And she has nothing she can do. And she's just quiet, she's hoping it's gonna end soon. And eventually this person would turn around and walk over to their cooler and their table and some other things that were out. And she hears some rummaging going on, some things are being moved around. And then this person just kind of walks off into the distance. But she doesn't know if they're gone. She doesn't know if they're standing in the edge of the tree line waiting for her to come outside. Maybe they laid a trap for her. And so she just lays there, silent, doesn't move, and she's praying to herself, please don't let anything happen to me or my father. And all night she's just laying there. And then eventually she does fall asleep. Probably hours go by, but she does fall asleep because she wakes up again when she hears her father unzipping his tent, and she charges out to meet him. And she can tell right away that he's scared. And before she can even say or begin to describe what's happened to her, he says, were you outside your tent last night at about 2, 3 in the morning? Because I heard all sorts of commotion near our cooler. I wasn't sure if it was an animal. I wasn't sure if it was you. And she starts telling him, no, this is what happened to me. And as she's describing what happened to her, he looks behind her at the picnic table, which was next to their cooler, and they had their backpacks on it. Basically anything that didn't fit in their tent they kept near this picnic table. And he points at it. And she turns around, and any item that was in the cooler or in their backpack, so that was just out, has been stacked in a pyramid formation on this table. Clearly, the guy who was here last night did this for some reason they don't understand. And as they go over to look at it to see if anything's been taken, they notice this track of footprints, like these heavy footprints that have been going around and around Kay's tent. So she clearly wasn't imagining. And so that instant, they packed everything up, got in their car, and they left. And to this day, they can barely talk about it with each other because it's all the things that could have happened. The father felt horribly guilty because he clearly heard this person but didn't leave his tent. And his daughter was clearly in danger. And his daughter's thinking, the tent was open. This person was crouched down, reaching into my tent, grabbing my feet. Like, that's such a horrifying image. And so this has been completely traumatizing for them, and they just don't talk about it anymore. From the 1950s until present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There was 2 others across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for quite a while. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of this dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve that was pretty much just a huge forest that was protected. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go explore. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve, and they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before, and they just started walking. And for about 30 minutes, they're seeing new areas they hadn't seen before, and then they come to this clearing, and there's all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned, because they did look like they were in pretty good condition. But when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature is reclaiming this land. Grass is up to your waist, there's vines growing up the side of the houses. There were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, and grass is growing all through them, and so they knew these were abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in, and they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished. In fact, their dining room tables still had plates and cups and forks and knives, like they had just had dinner and then just got up and left. They start talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, like, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? You know, should we not go inside these houses? And they start looking around for any indication that definitely this is not a museum, these are just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit looking house. Let's go over there and look in there. And so they look in a window, and very clearly the ceiling is totally sagging down. And the first floor is buckling completely, and there's clothes and shoes scattered everywhere. And so for them, this was confirmation that this is no museum. These are abandoned. We can totally go look around inside. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids explored all the houses that looked structurally sound. There weren't going to collapse on them. And it was just fascinating. There was all this stuff that was left behind that was fairly valuable. And they didn't take anything. They just thought it was very cool. And after a while, they decided they had seen enough, and they turned around and headed back to their cabin. After they got back, they told their parents about what they found, and their father was like, man, that sounds awesome. I want to go check that out. And so that day, they went right back over to the abandoned houses. The first house they showed him was the really decrepit-looking one where the ceiling was sagging and there was women's shoes and clothes all over the ground, to show him for sure these are abandoned, because we had some doubts at first too. These are definitely abandoned. So they look at that house, and then they went back to the very first house they saw when they walked into this complex, the one that was in great condition and had the dining table still set. So they go inside and they go upstairs and they find this bedroom that, like everything else in the house, is totally intact. You got pictures on the wall, it's fully furnished. There's even still sheets made on the bed, in the pillow. It's got a head imprint from whoever was there last. And at the foot of the bed is this beautiful fur coat. And the father walks over to it and he looks at it and he's like, this is real fur. This is a really expensive coat. I want to take this for our family. But before he took it, he had a hesitation. This is really abandoned. You know, if someone had been here, they would have seen footprints all over the house just because there's grime all over the ground. And they can clearly see their footprints from where they've just come in. And he's like, no, this is just a weird situation. It's definitely abandoned, and finders keepers. And so he picks up the jacket and he says, I'm going to give this to mom after I clean it up. And so with the jacket in hand, the father and the kids explore the rest of the house. And when they go outside, they realize it's starting to get late and it's probably time to head back. And so they turn around and they start walking away from these houses towards their cabin. And they get about 50 or 60 meters away when one of the kids said he just had this weird sense that they were being watched. And so he turns around, he's shocked, when he sees there is an old woman standing in the bedroom that they had just been in, where the fur coat was. She's got a loose bun on the top of her head, she's got this blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream blouse, and she's glaring at them. When the kid saw this woman, he made an audible gasp, and the rest of the group turned around too and saw this woman in the window. And the feeling was guilt. They're like, oh my goodness, we just stole from this poor woman who lives in this abandoned house. And so right away, the whole group starts walking right back towards the house. They're going to give this jacket back. In fact, the dad is like, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have taken this. I'm sorry. And as they're walking back towards the property, the woman in the window who hasn't said anything just turns around and walks back into the main part of the house. They can't see her anymore. And so as they're walking closer to the house, they're assuming she's going to come downstairs to retrieve this jacket that they've taken from her. And so they get right up to the front door, and the father is yelling to her, I'm sorry, where do you want me to leave this jacket? I can bring it into you. And they're kind of just waiting for her to come downstairs, and she doesn't. She's nowhere to be found. She's not making any sound. She's not indicating what to do. And so after waiting for a couple of minutes, the kids don't really know what to do, and they're kind of getting uneasy about the situation. And the father is still very confident that he just wants to give this back and make amends, make peace with her, say he's sorry. And so he walks inside. He tells his kids, stay here, I'm going to go give it to her. And he goes inside and he disappears upstairs. And then all of a sudden, from across the street in that decrepit house with the caved-in ceiling, they hear one of the second floor windows come slamming down. And at the same time, their dad comes charging down the stairs, no jacket with him, and he's saying, go, go, go. And the kids are spooked from the window getting slammed, and they start running away until they're about 100 meters away from these houses. And they stop, and they're panting, and they're out of breath. And the kids ask their dad, what happened? And he says to them, I looked everywhere upstairs and I could not find that lady. I don't know where she is, either she's hiding from us or something, but I happened to be looking out at that other house. Something caught my eye. There was movement, and I saw another person in the second floor of that building that's falling apart. And I watched them slam the window, and then as soon as I did, I heard someone yell, get out, and I ran out after you guys. Now the kids and the dad are absolutely terrified and they want to leave, but they also want one more look at these buildings before they do. And when they had run away, they had stopped behind this big group of trees that obscured their view to the buildings. They were out of sight. And so they begin to peek their heads around the tree until they can see the building, and they can't believe what they see. Standing in the window of the fur coat room is not only the old woman, but also a very tall man who's holding her shoulders and is bending down because his head is too high to look standing. He's crouched down and he's looking out the window next to her, and they're both glaring towards them. The father and his kids are practically falling over themselves to sprint away and back to their cabin. To this day, that family has no idea who those people were, what they were doing there, how they were able to move around without making any noise and consistently hide from them and not leave any footprints. It was all very strange and terrifying stuff. And then the government ended up demolishing those houses almost immediately after they were there, and so they'll never get any answers because everything's gone. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's stories and you haven't done this already, please offer to spot the like button for their next set of bench press, and then once they start to fatigue, just walk away. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's just John Ballen 416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See you.